Alrighty. So, structure number 1. What's the outside of a plant cell? Cell wall. Okay. 1 mark for cell wall. Okay. What is the function of the cell wall? Right. It supports the shape of the cell. Support, keeps shape, something along those lines. Okay. Is acceptable as the function. Okay. If they wrote protection, that's not right. Okay. Because we said before, the cell wall is not serving any protective function whatsoever. It only helps to support or keep the shape of the cell. All right, but in the future, if you write protect in any way, okay, if you had supports there, give it to them. Okay, for number 2, what are we looking at for number 2? That's the nucleus. Okay, what does the nucleus do? Stores DNA. Simple as that. Okay, nucleus stores DNA. So 1 mark for a nucleus, 1 mark for stores DNA, holds DNA, something about having DNA in it. Right? If they wrote brain of the cell, nothing. Okay? If they wrote controls cell functions, no. Okay? It's storing the DNA. All right. Number 3, the yellow stuff with the blue dots on it would be the rough ER. Okay, what's the primary job of the rough ER? Okay. Transports proteins, right. Okay, so 1 mark for rough ER, 1 mark for transports proteins, moves proteins, something about taking proteins from place to place. All right, what's number 4? If that stuff was the rough, this stuff is the smooth ER, right. Okay, now I will accept any one of the following answers for functions of the smooth ER. Okay, detoxifies poisons, repairs membranes, breaks down complex carbohydrates or starches. Okay, I'm forgetting something. Yeah, that's repairs membranes. So synthesizes lipids, repairs membranes. Yeah, that's the other thing. Yeah, they kind of work together. But yes. Okay, what's that? And produces hormones. Yeah, feels like Monday, but it's not. Happy birthday, by the way. Okay. All right, so if they had any one of those functions, okay, they can have a mark for the function of the, they didn't have to write them all, okay, just one of them would be fine. All right, number 5, the big clear thing in the middle. Water vacuole. And what does the water vacuole do? Uses Turgor pressure to support the cell. That's about as good an answer as we could get. Okay, if you just wrote supports the cell or helps keep the cell's shape, that's also fine, but it does use Turgor pressure to do that. No. It's got to say it specifically does that, because cytoplasm contains water too, right? Okay, for number 6, what are we looking at? Mitochondria. Okay, and what do mitochondria do? Okay, makes energy for the cell, burns sugar to release energy. I'll accept anything that has to do with making energy for the cell. It does not digest food, no. Okay, number 7. Chloroplasts. Okay, sorry, chloroplast, singular. That's only pointing at one. Okay, what do they do? Carries out photosynthesis. If they have anything about photosynthesis next to that one, they got it. Okay, what do you suppose those blue things are? Kenway. Microfibers, microfilaments, microtubules. I'll accept any one of those because it's really hard to tell which one it really is. So I'll accept any of them. Okay. Okay, since they all have the same job, which is cellulose fibers is also fine if they have cellulose fibers. Okay, cell fibers, no. Okay, they have to have specifically said what they're made out of. All right, so I will also accept cellulose fibers. Since this is a plant cell, that would also be acceptable. Okay, function is, okay, again, to support cell shape, keep the cell intact. Okay, something along those lines. All right, what's number 9 pointing at? Cytoplasm. Okay, and why do cells need to be filled up with a fluid called cytoplasm? Yeah, it's basically to facilitate transport. Okay, you guys talked about diffusion, okay, a little bit on Thursday and Friday of last week. Okay, in the podcast I talked about diffusion being the most common form of cell transport. Okay, without cytoplasm, diffusion wouldn't work. All right, so if they have something about keeping everything in place or facilitating transport or diffusion, no, that's more what it is, not what it does. Okay, all right, so if they have something about transport, okay, something like that, okay, then we're good. All right, for number 10, just inside of the cell wall is the cell membrane. All right, and what does the cell membrane do? Okay, today I will accept what goes in and out of the cell, controls what goes in and out of the cell. In the future, I will want the technical terms for that. That is, controls endocytosis and exocytosis, which we talked about, okay, Thursday and Friday. Okay, that's movement in and out of the cell. Okay, those are the technical terms for that. In the future, I will want the technical terms. Okay, but for today, if it says controls what gets in and out of the cell, okay, that's fine. All right, number 11. Can we? Golgi apparatus. Okay, and what does the Golgi apparatus do? Right, deals with transport outside of the cell. Deals with exocytosis. Gets rid of waste. I'll accept any one of those. Okay, it's essentially all the jobs it does. Okay, and number 12. Nucleolus. This one must be spelled correctly, guys. Okay, it's got to have 2 L's. Nucleolus. Right? And the nucleolus does what? Okay, produces RNA. I will also accept controls protein synthesis. Okay, as production of RNA is what causes protein synthesis, so we'll accept that. Okay, either one of those is a good enough answer. Okay, I'll also accept if they wrote copies DNA, because that's what making RNA is. Okay, was that your question, Ben? No. No. Okay, any other ones? All right, so it's out of 24 because each one was out of 2 marks. Okay, so give them a mark out of 24. Let them see it. Bring it up here, put it in the box. Okay, the big thing we want to look at today, guys, is how does the size of a cell affect the cell's ability to move materials from one place to another within the cell? Okay, now last week you talked about the 3 big methods of cellular transport. Okay, we call them the big 3. Okay, the big 3 are diffusion, osmosis, and active transport. Okay, these are the big 3 methods of cellular transport. Now, only one of these is actually used inside the cell. okay, in what we call intracellular transport. Okay, just like intramurals is, games played within the school, all right? Intracellular transport is transport within the cell. Okay, osmosis is not a method of transporting inside the cell. It's a method of getting water into or out of the cell across the membrane. Okay, osmosis is transport across the membrane of water. Okay, active transport is the pumping of any material across the membrane, either in or out. All right, so these two, okay, are not really about transport within the cell. They're about transport in or out. Okay, does everyone follow me there? But if something needs to go from, let's say, the lysosome to the mitochondria, it has to use diffusion. Okay, or if your cell absorbed something through its membrane and it needs to get somewhere within the cell, it's going to use diffusion. Okay, this is how intracellular transport occurs. Okay, through this process. Now, diffusion has certain positive characteristics. The biggest positive characteristic of diffusion is that it's free. Okay, in other words, it's what we call passive transport. Okay, it is something that just happens. Your cell actually can't control it. It just happens. Its other positive is that it generally gets things where they need to go, because diffusion is the passive movement of materials from where they are in large concentration to low concentration. So in general, it's moving things to where they're needed. They're needed where there isn't very much. Agreed? Right? So if something is being produced in one place of the cell, there's lots of it there. But it's probably needed somewhere where it's all been used up. So it's naturally going to kind of flow in that direction by diffusion. Okay? The problem is that you can't make sure that it goes to one specific place. Okay? Diffusion is not targeted. Okay? You can't say to diffusion, transport this stuff from A to B. Diffusion transports from A to everywhere. All right? Which in general still gets the job done, but okay, it doesn't always make sure lots of it gets to the spot where it's needed. Everyone follow? Okay. So really, what diffusion is like is the shotgun approach. Okay? When you fire a shotgun, the shot, that's the little balls, come out the barrel. Okay? But the further that shot has to travel, the wider it spreads out over. Okay? So right at the end of the barrel, there's lots of shot in a very small area. Okay? But if you were talking, let's say, 50 meters further away, the shot is spread out over a much greater area. Okay? Same with sound. If you shout, okay, and I'm standing right in front of you, it's pretty darn loud. Right? But if I'm standing, way across the football field and you shout, by the time the sound gets to me, it's spread out over a pretty large area. All right? So that's kind of how diffusion works. So the further something has to travel by diffusion, the less concentrated it's going to be by the time it gets there. Okay? And the other problem with diffusion is it's not all that fast. Okay? So if I have two cells, one this big and one that big, okay? The organelles are all the same size. Okay? Regardless of how big the cell is, a mitochondria is the same size in a big cell as it is in a small cell. Same with the nucleus. Okay? That stuff doesn't change. So here's my nucleus. There's my nucleus. They're about the same size. Okay? And let's say here's a lysosome. Okay? There's a lysosome. Let's say, and let's put in a mitochondria. So we'll just put in a red one here. So let's say there's a mitochondria right here, and there's a mitochondria right over here. What do you notice about the distance from the lysosome to the mitochondria? In the small cell, it's small. In the big cell, it's quite big. Okay? Now, If something is moving by diffusion, and let's say it's sugar, okay, because that's one of the things that the mitochondria is going to produce, and it's going to, or sorry, the lysosome is going to produce, and it's going to need to go to the mitochondria. If it's moving by diffusion, okay, diffusion will cause it to spread out a little bit on its way there. All right, so yes, right here, the sugar will be pretty concentrated. But as we get further away, it's going to be less concentrated. Now, let's look at that situation over here. Okay, sure, right next to the lysosome, the sugar is pretty concentrated. Okay, and we're looking at about how far away it was in that small cell. It's about like that. How much of that sugar actually got where it was needed? Not very much. And it probably took a lot longer for it to get there. Okay? Is everyone kind of seeing what I mean here? It's kind of an analogy to how things would move through a city. All right? If we look at, let's say, Calgary, for example, okay, there's really only two ways to effectively get through Calgary from north to south. What are they? Deerfoot and Stony. Okay, and before Stony came along, there was really just Deerfoot. Okay, if you've got a whole bunch of people trying to use the same transportation route, how fast do you go? Not very fast, right? Okay, it's very, very slow. Right? You look at a smaller place, okay, like Okotoks. Can you get through Okotoks quite a bit faster? Yeah, because A, there's less traffic, okay, and B, not as far to travel. Right? So you get through it a lot more quickly. So a smaller cell works better than a big cell. Right? This is why you don't see a giant amoeba sitting in the desk next to you. Okay? It's ineffective for a single-celled organism to get that big. Okay? Because how do you transport material in your body? Okay? How does stuff get from one place to another in your body? What's going on right now? Right, your heart pumps your blood, right? Is that kind of like active transport? It's forcing stuff from one place to another because it's large distances. Okay? If we relied on diffusion to move food from our intestines to all parts of our body, we'd die. Because it would take forever and it wouldn't get where it was needed. Right? Can you imagine stuff trying to diffuse against gravity from your intestines to your brain? Okay? Or even, let's say, oxygen from your lungs to your brain, having to diffuse that far. Okay? It just wouldn't work. It's way too far, and diffusion is way too slow, in addition to not targeted. Okay? Your bloodstream, it's got blood vessels going everywhere. Okay? And in fact, to some extent, it can even cut circulation off to certain places and make sure blood is going where it's really important and really needed. Okay? We've all had that experience. You go outside when it's cold. What's the first part of you to get cold? Hands, toes. Okay? Because right away, your body just cuts off circulation to your extremities in order to keep blood in the central areas, okay, your internal organs in your brain. All right? So, with a cell, that's not possible. A cell has to move materials by diffusion. So the larger it gets, the slower that process becomes. Okay? Now, there's another problem with getting big as a cell. Right? Cells are three-dimensional, so they're a sphere, not a circle. Okay? So they have a certain amount of membrane space compared to their internal volume. Okay? Now, membrane space is two-dimensional. It's surface area. Okay? And you calculate surface area by essentially going length times width if we're talking about like a square or something like that. Okay? But if you're talking about the volume of something, it's length times width times height. So there's three dimensions to think about. Okay? So as a cell gets bigger, its surface area increases. It has to because it's getting bigger. But its volume increases even faster. And the more volume it has, the farther things are going to have to move. All right? Now, what's the only way a cell gets materials? They have to come through the membrane, right? Okay? That's the only way stuff gets into the cell. They have to come through the membrane. So essentially, that surface area, the outer covering, is how the cell gets all its resources. So if it has a huge volume and comparatively much smaller area for supplying itself, it's got trouble. Okay? That's like trying to supply all the things the city of Calgary would need with one road. Okay? Can you imagine how many grocery trucks, gas trucks, basically anything that would be transported by truck, okay, would come into the city of Calgary in a day? Okay? It's like an unfathomable number of trucks. Okay? If there was only one road, let's say a 2-lane road, okay, coming into the city, would that be very effective? No. Okay? Not to mention the fact that that only gets it into the city, it doesn't get it where it needs to go. All right? Realistically, the city of Calgary has many roads coming into it. It has rail, air, okay, all kinds of different methods of transport to get material in. It has to, otherwise it wouldn't be able to supply all the people with what they need. Okay? And a lot of that material is actually sent to each individual home by pipelines that run underground. It's not like a truck actually has to pull up to your house and say, here's your natural gas, here's your groceries, okay, here's your water. A lot of that just comes in through services. Okay? Well, that's what the cell has got to do. It's got to deliver everything to every part of the cell, and it's got to do that reasonably quick. Okay? If it's got to do that over a large distance, the cell is not going to do well. So there's sort of an upper limit to the size a cell can achieve and still work efficiently. Right? And that is because diffusion is slow and not targeted. Okay? Everything is transported within the cell by diffusion, and that process is slow and not targeted. It's useful because it's free, and most cells are small, so it works. Okay? Diffusion works as long as you don't have a huge volume through which to move stuff. Okay? But if you get too big, it's not going to work. And cells kind of have a mechanism that tells them, you're getting kind of big. Okay? What do they do when they reach that point? They divide. Right? They divide that cytoplasm, and now there's 2 cells half that size. Okay? They work much more efficiently that way. Right? So cells really don't get all that large. The largest cell you would realistically encounter would probably be in the neighborhood of about 400 to 500 micrometers. Okay? Realistically, that's about the largest single cell that would work effectively. Okay? Most of the cells in your body are less than 100 micrometers. Okay? Next, on Thursday, when we do the cell anatomy lab, where we actually look at animal cells, plant cells, okay, blood cells, things like that, you're going to realize just how small the cells in your body are. They're more like the euglena was yesterday. Okay? The paramecium and the amoeba are on the upper end of large cells. Okay? Is that giving you guys some idea there? Yes? Okay. All right, so that has to do with cell size and diffusion. Now, quick review here of what's osmosis. Okay, this you don't need to write down because you got notes on osmosis. Okay, but that other stuff there was kind of important. Okay, osmosis, okay, is the movement of what? Water. That's the big thing we got to remember. Anytime a question says water is moving, you know you're dealing with osmosis. Okay, because osmosis only moves water, and it moves it across the membrane. What causes this movement? Is it active or passive? It's passive. Okay? The reason that water moves across a membrane is because of solutes. Okay? That is what's dissolved in the cell or out of the cell. Right? So if I've got a cell here, okay, and outside of the cell there's lots and lots of, let's say, sodium chloride. Okay? Cells don't like to have a lot of imbalance. So water moves which way? They don't want imbalance. There's less salt in the cell. So which way does water move? This way. Okay? Moves out of the cell. Okay? Having a lot of salt outside the cell will draw water by osmosis out of the cell. This is why you can't drink salt water. Okay? Pretty sure I said that in the podcast on Thursday or Friday there. Right? If you drink salt water, you're putting lots of salt into your bloodstream. Okay? And into your intracellular space. That draws water out of your cells. Okay? You actually end up urinating more, okay, if you drink salt water, okay, because the water from your cells gets out of your cells and into your bloodstream, and then your kidneys filter it out. Okay? If you have lots of salts within your cell, then water will start to move into the cells, which is usually what happens if you start to get dehydrated and then drink fluid. Okay? When you drink, let's say, just water, okay, then your cells will start to absorb, okay, the water in because they've already had water drawn out and the salts are getting very concentrated inside. Okay? So the water can move by osmosis quickly. Right? So your cells don't have to expend any energy to move water. It's a passive process, just happens. Okay? All right. And the other one was active transport. Okay? Active transport will transport anything, but what will it use? The other ones don't use it. Energy. It's active. Okay? Anything that's active requires an input of energy. So your cell has to expend energy to use this process. If it desperately needs something, it has no problem expending energy to get it. Okay? So there are special proteins on the surface of your membranes that actually act kind of like pumps. Okay? And they change shape and effectively draw stuff into the cell, but that takes energy. Okay? Everyone follow me there? Right? So sometimes your cells will do that. Your muscle cells do that all the time. Same with your nerve cells. Okay? When your muscles contract and your nerves fire, okay, it causes a rapid movement of sodium and potassium, okay, across the membrane. And in order for them to reset and do that again, they've got to actively pump those ions the other way. Okay? So you often see active transport happening in muscles and nerve cells. Not so much in other kinds of cells, but really in muscles and nerves. All right. Now, you also talked a little bit about this, about endocytosis. Okay? Endocytosis is completely different from the other three things we've talked about. It's completely different from osmosis. It's completely different from active transport. It's completely different from diffusion. Okay? Anything that ends in cytosis means the membrane actually envelops something. Okay? The membrane actually changes shape and envelops something. Okay? You guys follow me there? All right? So it's actually taking it in and making like a vacuole, okay, out of it. All right? So endocytosis, there's three methods of that. Okay? There's the phagocytosis that we talked about, which is like the enveloping of a large solid food particle or something like that. Okay? There's pinocytosis, which is mechanically the same. It's just enveloping fluid. And then there's receptor-mediated endocytosis, which is the enveloping of hormones and other chemical signals from the body. Okay? They're all mechanically the same in that the membrane changes shape in order to envelop something. All right? Does that happen often? I mean, it happens. It's fairly regular, right? But it's not really a method of transport of small materials. Okay? It's the ingestion of large things that can't move through the membrane. They have to be enveloped by the membrane instead. Okay? So active transport and osmosis and diffusion transport like molecules, small things. Whereas cytosis, endocytosis, each of the three methods transport things too big to pass through the membrane. Okay? So trying to think of an analogy here, and just one's escaping me. It would be like if you were moving into a house. Okay, if you have everything in small boxes, you can pass things through like a window even. All right, but your furniture would have to come in through the door. Okay, it's too big to go in through a small opening. It has to have a special way of getting in. Okay. All right, and then exocytosis. There's only one method of exocytosis. Okay, and that is through the Golgi apparatus. It packages the wastes into a vacuole, which looks exactly like what endocytosis does. It's just moving the other way. Right? So that bubble goes to the membrane, and when it hits the membrane, it pops. And whatever is in it gets forced out of the cell and into the space around it. Okay? So that's how cells typically get rid of large waste particles. Small waste particles can get out through diffusion, okay, things like that. Large waste particles have to go out through exocytosis. Okay, most of the time we focus more on the other three. Okay, everyone follow there? All right, so it's important to know kind of the differences, okay, between those things. All right. Okay, so we're going to talk here about transport in multicellular organisms. We're going to do a couple more things on cells this week, but okay, in terms of individual parts of the cell, we're kind of moving on from there. Thursday's quiz will be your last quiz on individual cell parts. Okay, so you had a plant cell today. Expect I'm probably going to give you an animal cell on Thursday. Okay, and then we'll be done with cells for a while. Okay, so you need lesson 8 in your notes package here, guys. So we need to understand how transport within cells is similar and still uses, okay, the same kind of principles as transport, okay, within a multicellular organism. Because after all, a multicellular organism is made of cells, right? So it's still going to use diffusion, osmosis, active transport, okay? It's just using it kind of on a bigger scale, right? Now we said diffusion is not going to work really well if we're talking about moving something from the roots of a giant sequoia to the leaves, okay? Obviously diffusion is not going to work across that kind of a distance. We're going to need something else, okay, in order to make that stuff move. So how do you suppose a plant would do that? Plants don't have a pump, okay? They don't have hearts, okay, inside that are, pumping away and moving water from the roots to the top of the trees. So how do you suppose they make that work? Nope. Not me. Nope. My phone's working fine. Okay, so we need to kind of look at that. So here's kind of how a plant works. It's going to use those processes because that's all it's got. Okay, it has to transport everything passively. It has no active way of moving material. So it's got to use the polar nature of water, okay, that we talked about before, along with osmosis. Okay, osmosis, believe it or not, can move and can create quite a lot of force. Okay, and we're going to look at how that works here in a minute. Okay, we're going to look at how nutrients, water, sugar, and minerals are transported in vascular plants. Now, what part of the plant makes sugars? The leaves. And the leaves are usually the top of the plant. Agreed? So can sugar be transported by gravity for free? Yes, and it is. Okay? There's no need to reinvent the wheel. If something will work for free, generally people will use it. Okay? And it's the same for plants. If gravity will pull the sugary, thick sap from the leaves down to the roots, that'll work. Okay? There's not really any rush in pumping it down faster than that. Okay, and we're going to look at the structure of vascular plants, not just, roots, stem, and leaves, but also the parts of the leaf and how the different types of cells in the leaf can interact in order to carry out the functions that are needed. Okay, and then again, the forces that are involved in transporting material. All right, vascular plants. The term vascular means that there's a series of tubes running through the plant. Okay, you can see those in a leaf. They're the veins. Okay, you can see veins running through the surface of a leaf. Okay, that's the vascular system, or the system of tubes that transports material from place to place. All right. Obviously, there's far more tubes in the stem of the plant than there are in the leaf. Okay, because the primary job of the stem is to transport things. The big deal for plants is that the stuff they need is in different places. Okay. The leaves need water and carbon dioxide. Now, they're surrounded by carbon dioxide, so that's not a problem. But where do they get their water from? From the ground. They can't absorb water. Okay? The leaves can't absorb water. All right? If you've ever seen, when you put a drop of water on a leaf, it doesn't absorb it. It just runs off. Okay? They're covered with a waxy layer called the cuticle, which actually prevents water from evaporating off of the leaf. but it also prevents water from getting in from the outside. All right, but that's fine because water can be transported from the roots. But obviously, that's two different places. Okay, so we've got to have a way of moving that material, okay, from one place to another. Okay, so there's a couple of ways a plant goes about that. Okay, plants have different sort of strategies for moving things and for storing their energy and things like that. Okay, if you ever noticed, like with strawberries and raspberries, they have a tendency to just appear. Okay, like you know, you planted the raspberries in one spot, but like later they're appearing everywhere. Okay, strawberries kind of do the same thing. All right, that's how they can ensure they always have a good supply of water and nutrients. Because you start getting a plant that's fairly large in one spot, and it can exhaust the nutrients and water where its roots are. And it doesn't really have the ability to expand much further than that. So what it does is it sends out what's called a stolon, which is a kind of stem. Okay, and when it touches ground somewhere else, or if it's a raspberry, tunnels under the ground to somewhere else, okay, it can start another plant. That plant will have its own root system, its own leaves and whatever, but it's also still connected to the original plant. So it can actually supply some water, nutrients, sugar, whatever, back to the original plant through the stolon. That allows them to expand and kind of creep, okay, around and become more spread out. Okay. All right, other plants, they'll store their energy. Okay, they might get a good kind of really broad leaf system going, okay, during the best times of the year for growing. They'll carry out a lot of photosynthesis. They'll make more energy than they actually use, so they'll store it. Okay, and they'll store it in the rhizomes or the tubers. Okay, those are different terms for roots that can store energy. So potatoes are a tuber, okay, and they are full of starch, okay, which is energy, okay, for the plant. Everyone follow? All right. So what they'll do, okay, is when the conditions for growing start to deteriorate, that is, days get shorter, temperature gets colder, okay, they'll just shut down all the photosynthesis, and in the spring, when things get better, they have a source of energy from which to draw to get started. Okay, you ever notice that if you leave a potato in the pantry, it starts to grow? Right? It gets the sprouts. Okay, first it gets the little eyes. If you leave it even longer, they'll start to get legs, turn into like a big spider looking thing, okay, inside the pantry. Right? That's because they're trying to grow into a new plant. In fact, if you let them go long enough, you'll see that they'll actually get little purple looking leaves on the sprouts. I know this because I once accidentally left some way in the back of my pantry and forgot about them. Okay, and I noticed there was this big purpley looking thing crawling towards the crack in the pantry door. Right, and when I pulled on it, this rotten potato came out with it. It's really gross actually, but okay. It actually had little purplish leaves on it, and if it had gotten to the front of the pantry, it would have been able to get some light, and it would have been able to start carrying out photosynthesis, right? Which is exactly what happens in the springtime. If you plant potatoes, you usually cut a potato in half and throw it in the ground. Okay, it'll sprout, okay, and it'll use the energy stored in the potato to produce roots and stems and leaves, right, Taylor? Okay, and then it'll get above ground to where it can carry out photosynthesis for itself. Okay, and then it can transport all of that stuff. Okay, onions and things like that can also do that, but they store the energy as sugar as opposed to starch in the base of the leaves. Okay, and that's why onions tend to be kind of sweet, where these tend to be a bit more bitter. Right? Okay, another adaptation. Vascular plants have to compete for light. Okay, that is their big thing. They have to compete for light. I know it doesn't seem like plants are really competitive, but they are. Okay, they grow tall and they try and shade each other out. But in order to get tall, you have to be able to support yourself. And we talked about this when we talked about the structure of the plant cell. Okay, you can use your cell wall and you can use your water vacuole. That'll work to a certain size. Beyond that, there's going to be too much weight to support with just turgor pressure and cellulose. So they start secreting a protein that cements the cells together. Okay, and that protein is called lignin. Okay, and lignin, okay, makes the stem go from being green tissue to being wood. Okay, because it cements the cells together and makes them very hard on the outside. Okay, and then typically those cells die, okay, shortly thereafter, and new cells grow on the other side of them. All right, so that's why the trunk of a tree, like in the middle, sometimes it's even rotten in the middle when you cut down a really old tree, because those cells have been dead for a long time. But their cell walls were cemented together when they were alive, and it stays that way. Okay, and that helps to create that really strong structure that can support a giant tree like that one. Okay, some plants will use it in order to protect their seeds. Okay, so any plants that create nuts, okay, that their seeds are held in, okay, the shell of a nut is essentially made of lignified cell walls, right? It's very hard, right? And so as a result, their seeds are well protected. Pine cones are another example of that. Okay, some pine cones, as they dry out, they'll crack open, and other ones, they don't open until they're actually set on fire. Okay, they are covered in a resin, okay, that protects them, and then when they get hot, they expand, pop open, and the seeds come out after that. Okay, making sense? All right. All right, so we talked about turgor pressure here, okay, and what happens if a plant needs or is getting water or not getting water. All right, so we've got, okay, a plant cell here that's got water vacuoles that are full of water. Okay, so you can see that the water vacuoles are quite large, and they're pushing everything in the cell outwards against the cell wall. And in that case, the turgor pressure can support even a fairly large flower. Right? But as the plant doesn't get water, it'll begin to draw water out of the water vacuoles. Okay? When that happens, okay, the ability of the cells to push decreases. When it gets really bad, the cell membrane will actually begin to peel away from the inside of the cell wall. And when that happens, it actually pulls the plant and makes it look wilted. Okay, so it makes it look like this. The leaves look soft, okay, and it doesn't look healthy anymore, okay, because the water vacuoles, as you can see, have shrunk, and they're no longer pushing everything against it. In fact, it creates almost a vacuum that actually starts the reverse and almost a pulling action the other way. Okay, so parts of the plant. Obviously, roots are part of the plant. Okay, the job of the roots is a few things. First off, they anchor the plant. That's important because plants are exposed to wind. Okay, they get grazed on, right, and they don't want to be uprooted when an animal comes along and chews on them. Okay, things like that. But they're also obviously responsible for acquiring water and nutrients. Okay, but there are two types of roots. Tap roots, like this one. Okay, so this would be a tap root, okay, and fibrous roots. Okay, now, which one's better? Well, actually, it depends. It depends on the situation. They both have advantages. They both have disadvantages. Okay, if you're a carrot, for example, obviously a carrot is a tap root. Does it have very much foliage above the ground? Right, so it doesn't need to worry about being pulled out of the ground by wind. Okay, not very many things graze on the top of a carrot. Okay, because it's kind of bitter, right? It's not full. It's not really, you know, a big leafy, sweet kind of leaf that things will want to eat. So it doesn't have to worry about that kind of stuff. So all it does is grows this big long taproot, which it can store energy in. Now, surface area is important for absorbing water. The more surface area you have, the more water you can absorb. Does a taproot have very much surface area? No, it doesn't. Okay, it's mostly volume. Okay, it's thick and big. Okay, whereas very little surface area. But again, there's not that much foliage above ground that requires water. So what you'll see off of a taproot are those little root hairs. Okay, is actually what they're called. So when you pull a carrot out of the ground, right, there's little white roots coming off the side of it. That's actually where the bulk of the absorption happens, is through those little white hairs. Okay. Now, for a fibrous root, okay, a fibrous root spreads out. Some of them will go fairly deep, okay, but for the most part, they spread out fairly shallow, but a long way away from the plant. So there's certain advantages to that. The wider out you are, the better your base of support, which is usually why large trees have a fibrous root system. It allows them to anchor themselves in many directions and against lots of earth. All right, because usually in a big windstorm, trees get broken off as opposed to uprooted. Agreed? I mean, once in a while you see a tree get uprooted, but most of the time they just get broken off. okay? Because they get all this extra support, and they get support in all directions, because other than like here where the wind always comes from the same direction, okay? In lots of places it can come from different directions, so they got to be able to support themselves that way, okay? And with your roots going everywhere, you have much more surface area through which to absorb water and nutrients, which is also advisable if you've got a lot of foliage above ground, which a tree does, okay? And it needs lots more water. Which one do you suppose a cactus would have? Yeah, they actually do. Like a saguaro cactus, the ones that are on the taco time sign, right, with the arms, okay? They actually have a fibrous root system, and it can stretch from 50 to 80 meters away from the plant. And it goes about this deep. Only a few inches. Okay? Because does the soil ever get wet enough for it to absorb any deeper than that? Nope. Okay, it lives in the desert. So it wants its roots right at the surface, because anytime there is any rain, it's only going to go this far into the soil. So it needs its roots right at the surface, and it needs lots of them. So they have a mat of roots around them in a big circle, right, that helps them to absorb water whenever it's available. Having a really deep root in the desert isn't going to do you much good. Soil's generally not that deep anyway, okay, and it's dry all the way down, unless you can tap an aquifer, okay, which some desert plants like the mesquite bush can do. But for the most part, you're going to see fibrous roots. Okay? Tap roots are far less common than fibrous roots. Most tap roots are energy storage as opposed to absorption. All right. Stems. Okay? Stems are green, so yeah, they carry out some photosynthesis, but not very much. Okay? Because most of the time they're shaded by the leaves and they're down below and whatever. But they are green. Okay? They can carry out some photosynthesis, but primarily their job is to support the foliage and to transport materials from the roots to the foliage, okay, to the leaves. All right, so you've got kind of this system. The stems are also where growth occurs from. Okay, stems will produce stem cells. That's actually where the name comes from. Okay, in the buds. All right, so there's always little buds, all right, on the terminal end, okay, of branches and things like that. Okay. The buds contain stem cells. They can essentially become anything the plant needs. They can become leaves, they can become flowers, they could become, okay, more stem, whatever the cell, whatever that plant needs at that particular time. All right? So in this case, it's really handy because something came along and chewed off this, okay? Because this happens to plants all the time, right? An animal comes along and eats them. Well, they can't just die. They have to do something. So these buds here that didn't get eaten will start to grow in order to replace the lost foliage. Okay, so like by mowing your lawn will actually get thicker, okay, because it'll grow from below. If you have a hedge or any plants that you trim regularly, okay, you can make them appear fuller the more you prune them. All right, because you take off, okay, some of the other stuff and it has to grow from further back, and that can give it a really full outward appearance. Anyone ever gone to a hedge maze before? Okay, not a corn maze, but like a real hedge maze. Okay, the way they make those is they just keep trimming those things. They just keep trimming the outer edge so it keeps growing from inside and getting thicker and thicker and thicker. All right, now obviously the stem, okay, uses a lot of turgor pressure, a lot of those cellulose fibers, and also a lot of lignin in order to create that support. All right, this one's super important. Parts, layers of the leaf. Okay, parts and layers of the leaf. Okay, we're not going to worry about the C4 leaf. Okay, you don't have to worry about that. That's like cacti and stuff like that. This is your typical vascular plant leaf structure. We're actually going to look at it on Thursday under the microscope when we look at plant cells. Okay, so this is the top of the leaf. This is the bottom. Okay, what we have is on both the top and the bottom this layer here called the cuticle. Okay, the cuticle is a layer of wax. Okay, and if you've ever felt the leaf of a plant, it often feels kind of waxy on the top, okay, and on the bottom. That's secreted by the epidermis. Okay, the epidermis basically is just a transparent layer, okay, that secretes this cuticle, and the cuticle seals the leaf so that water cannot escape. All right? In the same way that if you wax your car, water can't penetrate into the paint and start the corrosion process in the metal underneath. All right, you guys follow me there? If you've ever seen like a freshly waxed car, when it rains, the water just beads and then runs off, right? Makes the big beads on there as opposed to just kind of being flat. Okay, well, the surface of a leaf is the same way. There's a waxy layer that prevents water from evaporating through it. Okay, some plants don't have that layer. For example, moss. Okay, moss is not a vascular plant. It does not secrete a cuticle. If you put moss out in the sun, how quickly is it crunchy? Pretty quickly. Okay? Because it doesn't have this layer that prevents evaporation. So it just rapidly evaporates. Now, you take that crunchy moss, you throw it in the water, and it's like a sponge. Okay? It'll just absorb it all back up because it doesn't have a cuticle and water can move in through it. Okay? But for most plants, this is the better way to go. Okay? Because usually, moss grows under a thick canopy of plants that are protected from the sun. Okay? Underneath that epidermis is what we call the palisade layer. You don't have to remember the mesophyll part, just palisade layer. This is where photosynthesis occurs. Okay? The bulk of the photosynthesis performed by a plant, okay, is in that layer, the palisade layer, because that's where the cells are stacked as close together as possible. Right? So we have a very, very dense layer of cells with lots and lots of chloroplasts, okay, carrying out photosynthesis. Okay, underneath that, we see that the cells look quite a bit different. Right? It's called the spongy layer because, well, there's holes in it. It looks like if you cut a sponge, you can see kind of the bubbles in the sponge. Okay? And it is really like a sponge because fluid comes out of this vein, which is bringing water from the roots, and it moves by osmosis and through diffusion through these cells and into this area. Okay? What's also in here is carbon dioxide. It moves in through the stomates. Okay? And that carbon dioxide moves up to these cells because they need it to carry out photosynthesis. So water and carbon dioxide move through the spongy layer. It actually kind of gets stored in there to the palisade layer. Right? So we store those needed things in here so that they can move quickly by diffusion and osmosis over a short distance to where they're needed. Right? So that's what the spongy layer does. Again, you don't have to remember the word mesophyll, just spongy layer. Right? Lots of chloroplasts in there, and then this thing right here. Specialized cells located usually on the bottom of the leaf, okay, called guard cells. 2 guard cells make up a stomate. A stomate is like a pore. It's a hole. It's a hole that can open and close. And that's how the plant regulates how much photosynthesis goes on. Photosynthesis can't occur unless water is evaporating and carbon dioxide is moving in and out. All right? The stomates are what controls that movement. As the plant begins to dry out, okay, carries out lots of photosynthesis, the water vacuoles inside the guard cells begin to empty. And when that happens, the guard cells change shape and close the stomate off. Okay? Later on through the night, when more water can get back into those cells, that changes the shape of the guard cells and the stomate opens back up again. Okay? So through the day, the stomate naturally closes because water is being lost. Okay? And then through the night, as it absorbs more water, the stomate naturally opens back up. Right? So the stomates are an example of a specialized cell, okay, that's doing a very important job for the plant. Okay. We'll leave it at that because the bell's going to go here right away. When is your microscopy lab due? Friday. All right? You can come in and see me, scheduled help anytime this week if you want some help on that. Okay? Don't leave it till the night before because if you have trouble with the drawings the night before, you're cooked. You won't be able to come in and see me on Friday because there's no scheduled help. So make sure you're trying to get that done before Friday.